G'day guys, my name is Ben and welcome to the channel, and today we'll be talking about the 2020 MacBook Pro. Well, not just the 2020 MacBook Pro, but also the 2016 and the 2015 MacBook Pro, because I have all of them right now in front of me and I've actually owned and used all of these computers for an extended period of time. So considering there is still such a cult following for the 2015 MacBook Pro, I thought I'd do a little bit of an ownership review here just to talk to you about what I do and don't like about these three laptops. So if you've watched a few of my other videos, you might be wondering, why do I have three MacBook Pro computers? And the answer is pretty simple actually. I have both personal and work computers here. So my personal computer is the tried and true 2015 MacBook Pro model, and I've had that computer since new, and while it does stumble a little bit, it's been a very solid computer and it's actually followed me all around the world. I've been to Europe, America, Indonesia, all these other countries, and this guy just keeps on going. And my 2016 MacBook Pro, that's actually my work computer that is finally going into retirement. And this computer is actually the very first generation of the dongle book era. So the very first model that had all the USB-C ports, the very first generation of the butterfly keyboard, the very first of all the problems that you've read about and that I have experienced. It certainly has been an interesting journey with this computer, but suffice to say, I am very thankful to be finally moving on to the 2020 MacBook Pro. The 2020 MacBook Pro is my replacement computer from the 2016 MacBook Pro. I've actually had this computer a few months now and I really enjoyed using it compared to the 2016. It's like they've analyzed every single problem that 2016 had, and they've basically resolved most of them. So all I really want to talk to you today is just kind of talk to you about my experiences with all these computers, because I know the 2015 has such a cult following still, and I know the 2016 does not. But also, I kind of wanted to compare more or less my experience with the 2015 moving across to the 2020 model of the MacBook Pro. If you're interested, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It is greatly appreciated. And make sure you check out the written description and leave a comment as well. So with that said, let's talk about the 2015 MacBook Pro. So as I said, this has been my personal computer for about 5 years, and to be honest, I'm really surprised that at 5 years it's still going strong as my personal computer. I generally was expecting to probably get 3 years out of this computer, but it just keeps going and going and going, so I'm really happy with that. To be honest, as my lifestyle's changed over the last 5 years, my need for a personal laptop is not as great anymore. This custom PC that you can see behind me doing most of the heavy lifting that I was pushing through that laptop, the MacBook Pro now really just serves as my email and internet machine for when I want to chill out on the couch and things like that. It is now an occasional use computer. But before it did become that, it was my primary computer running across these two screens, getting a workout, and it has done a very good job. That keyboard is timeless and it is wonderful to use and feel still today. Even the Logitech keyboard that I have behind me that I use as a hybrid keyboard for both my Mac and PC computers doesn't have the experience that that one does. And after the keyboard, obviously, the best thing about this computer is all those ports that you know and want. For my later computers, using those USB-C dongles and adapters, they never work all the time. There is always a chance something won't connect or go wrong. Even with the fancy USB-C adapters, they just don't always work when you need them to. And with the 2015 MacBook Pro, it's almost foolproof that every time you plug something in, it will work. So I guess after 5 years though, the computer has started to kind of run out of steam. And obviously as we've moved to kind of larger screens and faster refresh rates and 4K video and all these kind of things, this computer does struggle with a lot of that content. Basically, what eventually triggered me to kind of buy that computer behind me was that my personal computer just could not handle Premiere Pro. It was really going slow doing photoshopping on files from like my Sony a7 III. And I just kind of got sick of waiting around for progress bars to finish. And these days too, just running Google Chrome with a few tabs open will send the fan into overdrive and the computer will sound like a jet engine almost with any type of use these days. But that's to be expected of a 5-year-old computer, right? Like, I know people with 5-year-old laptops that just barely turn on. So it is a great computer, but even with all that fancy technology like the integrated video cards and things like that in the 2015 model, they aren't really up to scratch if you're kind of going down a 4K video gaming type workflow. So this MacBook's also had all the repairs and recalls done to it, and there's two that I kind of wanted to talk about today, and one of those is the screen. So after about a year of owning this laptop, I noticed that the screen basically had a complete mirror image of my keyboard on it. Effectively, the keyboard had scratched its way into the screen. It was a bit insane, especially as a computer with 1 year's worth of use, and it was also being used 50% of the time as a desktop computer. I took it into Apple and Apple said, right, yep, we know there was a problem with the screens, we will replace it for you under warranty. And I got a new screen and it's actually held up perfectly good. There is basically not a mark on this screen even 5 years in. But my problem with the 2015 MacBook Pro, and for those of you watching, if you were actually thinking of buying one, is that recall, at least in Australia, was voluntary. You had to take your computer to Apple and tell them that you had the problem. I have friends of mine, whether they're work colleagues or friends, that have the same computer and they did not get their screen replaced. And let me tell you, it looks like today that someone with a knife and fork has scratched the living shit out of the screen, and it is impossible to use, especially outside. So do yourself a favor, and if you are buying one, make sure you see if the screen has been recalled and replaced. So the other big recall that I wanted to mention too was that one around the battery, and that was about a year ago when the MacBooks were kind of on the news saying that their batteries could explode, and then the airports and airlines banned all of the batteries and MacBooks and things like that. And I actually went to the United States last year on a holiday and had to get my laptop battery repaired quickly so I could actually take it on the flight. Because when I actually boarded my flight to America, the airport actually checked my MacBook and checked the documentation to see if it had been recalled. And that all went perfectly fine and smoothly, but the actual recall itself, the technician at Apple actually told me that that recall replaced half the components of the computer. So that recall got me a new keyboard, a new battery, and a whole heap of other new internals. And I was really hoping that that whole suite of new parts would actually bring life back into the computer, maybe fix that kind of overheating jet engine fan noise that I was mentioning earlier. Unfortunately, it did not, but I did get a fresh keyboard out of it, and most importantly, I could take the computer on the aeroplane, and that was a good win. Now, to talk about some of my favorite things about this computer too, without a doubt, it is just simply that there's no touch bar on this computer. There's no gimmicks. It is a simple keyboard with regular old buttons. And I'll talk about the touch bar later, but I personally am not a fan of it. And I really do appreciate like the simplicity of this computer. It's almost like it was the last computer before technology kind of took off and Apple started to take gambles on all these new and weird ideas on technology. So it doesn't have your fingerprint scanner and all those other bits and pieces. It's just a computer and it's exactly what you know and understand. And that's my favorite thing. Now the computer is a bit thicker, wider and heavier than the other computers. And if you are getting in the market for travel, you really do notice once you move on from that computer how much heavier and large this laptop is. Compared to modern laptops, the 2015 MacBook Pro is quite a big computer. But you must admit the computer still does look good thanks to the way Apple styles their products. So yeah, so to sum up the 2015 MacBook Pro, this computer is a great computer for just general use now. I think if you're kind of getting into kind of the content creation space and things like that, it's probably good to keep you going. And the way that these computers in particular are holding their value at the moment, it's probably a really safe bet to buy because you could likely sell it for exactly the same price or close to if you decide to do something better. All right, the 2016 MacBook Pro. What an adventure we have been through over the last 4 years. Before I even get into the computer, it has disappeared out of my life on multiple occasions for repairs, for recalls, for battery replacements, for keyboard replacements. It has been arguably a nightmare. In fact, while I've been waiting for my 2020 MacBook Pro to arrive, this computer was hanging on by a thread. Overall, this computer was problematic and you cannot compare it to the reliability of the 2015. Now the 2016 MacBook Pro, that's been my work computer for 4 years now, and we've been through a lot together. The general programs and stuff that I use for work is a mix of like your general kind of corporate admin software, emails, Word, PowerPoint, things like that. But With my creative work that I do, there is extensive Photoshop and Premiere work and a little bit of 3D programming and things like that too. So it was pretty exciting to get the 2016 MacBook Pro when it first arrived. Whole new model, new ports, new keyboard, new this, new that. And really for me, it did not take long until kind of the honeymoon period wore off and I really started to get annoyed by some of its features. Now in 2016, USB-C was obviously a very unknown port for most people. And when I actually got this computer at work, like the tech teams had trouble finding screens and adapters and ports and cables that would actually work with this computer. And eventually it took a while, but we did have a winning formula. Now with the 2016 MacBook Pro, I certainly did not like the keyboard that came with it. And after a couple of days of use, particularly back then before COVID, when we were working in an office, it was within days that my colleagues were starting to complain to me about how loud the keyboard was. It really is like you're tapping on a thin piece of plastic and it is loud and tacky. According to my colleagues, the volume of my keyboard is kind of at a level where it's like dragging your fingernails down a blackboard. It's just at that frequency that can kind of overpower something else. Now this MacBook 2 introduced the touch bar and I personally am not a fan of the touch bar and I have not really found too many uses for it. As a touch typist, I guess, I really prefer knowing where those keys are without needing to kind of hold certain buttons to bring up a screen that represents what those original buttons should be. So being able to jump through all these different apps and figure out the shortcuts and things like that didn't really appeal to me. What I have found helpful though is really reverting the touch bar to the same features that my 2015 personal computer had. And without a doubt, my favorite shortcut is just simply the quick switching between apps and also the show desktop button. And that's really all I use the touch bar for on this computer. It just seems like most developers don't really care about the touch bar either, and there's really not much support outside of the core Apple suite. The thing that kind of annoyed me a little bit compared to when I'm using my 2015 is using the right click function on the big trackpad often got a little bit annoying because you really did have to kind of move across to the right side to use that click properly. Also, as you'll see a little bit later in the video, the 2016 MacBook really performs at almost exactly the same level as the 2015. Now this computer did have a bump up in specs, but it just seems like, especially after this amount of time, that it's really not enough to justify a performance gain. And especially doing travel and things like that with the 2016, you really do appreciate how much more lightweight and portable that computer is. But while I say that, this computer and the 2020 still mean you need to bring all those dongles and adapters with you. However, in 2020, most devices have a USB-C port now and cabling, and really it does simplify the whole process. So some common problems that I had with the 2016 was just random and frequent crashes. I would have frequent Bluetooth disconnection issues, in particular with the 2016, with my other computers not having the same level of Bluetooth connection trouble. I'd also had problems with their USB-C ports as well. In fact, I actually had to get them replaced under warranty. It was quite common for me to lose connection to my desktop screens with no explainable reason. Literally having to unplug, replug, on again, off again, repeatedly on this specific laptop before it would start working again. And especially in apps like Photoshop and PowerPoint too, like you would just randomly have crashes that would shut the whole computer down repeatedly, almost by doing the same process every single time. Just on the 2016 MacBook Pro though, and yes, we have reformatted the computer to see if that would fix it, and didn't. That keyboard, man, that keyboard, it was so bad, like it got replaced multiple times in the 4 years that I've owned it, but even then, like on the day I got my computer back after being repaired, I had like a tacky key that didn't work properly. And after dealing with the whole replacement process, you can't put your computer back in and go through the whole process again. So I just lived with this tacky key and eventually it kind of gave up and started working normally. What I will say though is towards the end of its life, I guess more like around 2019, 2020, I really did start to appreciate that USB-C port. Almost everything I had was powered by USB-C at this point. If I traveled, I'd just have to chart like one USB-C cord that would do almost every device that I had, and that was amazing. So yeah, if you're looking in the secondhand market and you're kind of evaluating whether you should go 2015 or 2016, go the 2015. Now, I think there's a few benefits to the 2016 MacBook Pro now in 2020. Obviously, you get those USB-C ports and things like that, but the keyboard and the connection problems and all of that stuff, I really do find it hard to recommend. And for me, I am so happy that I'm finally able to move on. So the 2020 MacBook Pro, I just got this computer a couple of months ago, and I thought I'd kind of give it a little bit before I kind of put this video together just to make sure I'm happy with it. And without a doubt, this is the best MacBook I've ever had, and it fixes every problem that the 2016 had, and I'm really, really happy about it. The only thing it didn't is, as I mentioned, I'm not a fan of that touch bar, and it still has a touch bar, but you do get a few buttons back, which is nice. Now, really, the 2020 does have a 16-inch screen, and yeah, it really, really is nice. Like, you really do appreciate the extra brightness and the extra size, and particularly while we've been working at home in COVID, I have really enjoyed the extra brightness on this screen because I can sit outside and still comfortably read the screen. And because the screen is a little bit bigger on this model, it does get a little bit of a larger footprint compared to the 2016 model, which is the smallest of all three. The keyboard, though, is where the magic happens, and this keyboard is a significant improvement over the 2015 keyboard, and that was a good keyboard in itself. I am really excited to see Apple release the same keyboard technology for like their iMac and desktop computers as well, because I think it will be a fantastic option for people. With the exception of those two features though, I mean, really it is a very similar computer. Like, this one has an upgraded GPU and also 32 gig of RAM, and it really does help the computer perform a lot better. Now, jumping into Photoshop and Premiere and things like that, it's actually doing a really good job with all that editing work, especially with 4K files and things like that, which I was actually a bit surprised on. In fact, you can see this big computer behind me, the PC computer, and the MacBook Pro actually does a great job in keeping up with it in terms of performance. One thing that was a bit of a surprise to me, especially in Adobe Premiere, was I've actually used this PC behind me to do most of my video editing, but occasionally I'll transfer files across to my MacBook to continue work there. And one thing in particular, especially on timeline previews, I found the MacBook does a really good job with them, and in fact can kind of keep up with the PC as well, which was quite a surprise. Now, obviously this is a new computer, so I don't want to say the battery is such an improvement over my 5 and 4 year old computers, but it really is. I can go a very long time without this plugged in, and it really has been great. Now, one thing that's a little bit of a shock to the system when you first turn this computer on is this MacBook Pro has the True Tone display, which will kind of adjust the coloring on your screen dependent on the lighting situation that you're in. So at nighttime, for instance, it will give you like a more warmer screen compared to what the other two MacBook Pros do. And it is certainly not good for anyone in a creative industry. You know, if you're chasing color accuracy or anything like that, this is not a feature for you. I would really encourage you to turn it on if you're doing, you know, casual browsing on the couch while you're watching TV or something like that. But for any professional work, it is a very big problem. And I think if you don't have your MacBook sitting next to an older MacBook like I do, you might suddenly adjust without really noticing how much different the screen quality is in terms of color out of the box. If you put these two screens side by side, it does not take long to see how much more yellow the MacBook is with its True Tone display turned on. And even messing around with the color settings on the screen with the feature turned on, I really can't get it to represent that color that is consistent across all of the other Apple ranges. And thankfully, I did learn you can turn this feature off, and now the MacBook looks almost the same as all the other Apple products, which is great and feels like home. Because that's the thing you get with Apple, right? Like, you get that consistency that you can trust. And you know, when you look at like my 2015 MacBook Pro against my 2016, against someone's iMac, against someone's iPad, that color system and color representation across all those screens is very, very similar. It's the Apple look that everyone wants, especially in the creative industry. And yeah, opening that lid up on the MacBook, you're like, whoa, what is going on here? So if you do that, don't stress. It's a fancy feature to kind of help give your eyes a rest, but if you turn it off, you'll get that look that you know you want. So while it's not really a review, one thing that I will do here is show you the difference in performance across these computers. So I've actually grabbed some video files from Premiere that I produced for a YouTube video on my Audio Engine A2 speakers. And I've just put this video in Premiere across all of the 3 laptops here. And I'm just going to do a really quick recording to see the time difference between all these 3 computers to hopefully see the 2020 show that it's a significantly faster computer. Well, there you go, guys. As you can see, the 2020 MacBook Pro destroys the performance of these 2 computers. But what's actually a surprise is that the 2015 and 2016 computers are almost identical in rendering performance in Premiere. And with that in mind, I really do feel like, especially as a power user across these 2 computers, that the performance between both is very, very similar. So obviously shaving 3 or so minutes off your rendering time is a great thing with the new MacBook, but it's the power that kind of keeps all the other processes running smoother, which is where you'll really start to improve your time. So for example, putting a clip in Premiere and putting Warp Stabilizer on, the MacBook 2020 does a much better job in handling the rendering and processing of that file. Once you run that clip, you don't need to render it before you can preview it, for instance, whereas on these 2 older computers, you had to render everything in the timeline before you could see it without it being super choppy. So in terms of efficiencies, the 2020 is so much better for efficiency across the board. I would highly recommend it if you have the budget to do so. For the off-the-shelf models of the MacBook Pro as well, I don't know why there is no off-the-shelf model that has 32GB of RAM, but if you are prepared to pay the extra, make sure you go and get the 32GB of RAM, especially if you're doing any creative work, because that 16GB out of the box will get eaten up extremely quickly, whether that's Google Tabs, Premiere, Photoshop, whatever you're doing. 16GB is not much for what you might be doing with this computer, especially going forward into the future. So while it is still early days for me, really, with the 2020 MacBook Pro, so far the experience has been great. And I will say, it has been a much better experience at this point in time compared to the 2016 at the same period. And the future of Apple computers is interesting too, isn't it? So Apple announced that their future computers are going to be powered by their own internal chips and moving away from the Intel processors that we know and love. And look, as an original early adopter of the 2016 MacBook Pro and going through the dramas that I have, I am so happy that I have got an Intel processor in the 2020 MacBook Pro. While I'm sure that Apple was going to do some revolutionary stuff with their new MacBooks, I certainly do not want to be the first adopter for this after experiencing what it's like to be a first adopter with a whole new generation. So if I had to rank my 3 MacBooks in order of preference, I would be putting the 2016 at the bottom of the podium in 3rd position, followed by the 2015 MacBook Pro. I think that is still the most versatile Mac that you can get considering its price point in the secondhand market. And of course, the 2020 really does deliver the right value now. And considering the USB-C ports are so common and it's really a great port to have on your computer now, the 2020 really does fit a great workflow today. And it's really nice that on the 2020, the screen is a little bit bigger at 16 inches in size. While it's nothing significant and really won't impact your day-to-day, occasionally you do kind of sit there and go, yeah, it is a lot bigger. And it is nice, especially that brightness that I mentioned. But just make sure if you're doing creative work to turn that True Tone option off because it can mess with your coloring. So I think especially if you're a creator of some sort, whether that's photographer, videographer, 3D stuff, I really do feel in particular that the 2015 doesn't have enough juice for you. If you're starting out and maybe using an older camera or something, I think if your suite of equipment is kind of more based around the 2015, 2016 era, I think that those laptops will do you amazingly. But I think for the more modern technology, which seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger in megapixels and resolution and all that type of stuff, I don't think the MacBook in the 2015 or 2016 era really has enough juice for what you need. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really just wanted to kind of document my ownership experience. So I hope you found that helpful in one way or another. And if you do have any questions, I obviously do have some extensive experience with these computers, and I'll be happy to offer my opinion should you be interested. Otherwise, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you around for the next video. Cheers.